What would you say was your big break from going from like a PA and an editor who's cutting highlights to now doing features to now doing long form content?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of space in between, starting to do these features and then, or starting to do, the short features into docs. And those steps were running my own shows, higher profile shows. I think ultimately one of the bigger ones was I ran a show called The Association, which ESPN aired. The ESPN Films aired the first year. We followed the Lakers for a whole year and turned that into a 1 hour special. And then the next year we did 6 episodes on the Celtics, and then the Brooklyn Nets. So I ran all of those shows. But right around the time of The Association with the Lakers was the impetus of 30 for 30. Right. So they had come to the NBA and said, what do you have to offer? Basically, what films would you want to do? And I remember there were 2 that were being kicked around. One was The Dream Team, which we ultimately did for NBA TV, and then the other was Once Brothers. And so really getting on that film with Mike Talasian as a producer and an editor and a shooter was the first real film that I really had sort of an ownership stake in the sense that, I was actually helping to put it together with Mike. I mean, it was all, it was Mike's baby. He wrote and directed it. He took me on as a producer. We went to Croatia and Serbia. And that was the first taste that I had gotten of making a film. And we did, I think, a good job on that film. People really liked it. And then after that, based on the success of that, when ESPN came back to us, I think I was the natural choice to produce and direct these films and NBA TV. I think The Dream Team was the next one. Yeah.
We'll get into that here shortly, but I wanted to ask you, when you do produce, because we're going to ask you about Once Brothers, what is the difference for our listeners when you're producing and when you're directing? What is the role of the producer what was your role on Once Brothers?
Yeah, it's actually funny because in the traditional sense, a producer is sort of smoothing things out for the director. I think that's probably for me the easiest way to distill that into something sort of easy to understand. That person is, if for a documentary, maybe reaching out to potential interviewees and forming a relationship with them, gaining their trust so that they will tell the story. And then the director will step in and do the interviews. That's the traditional sort of producer role in a doc, right? Mm-hmm. Behind the scenes, helping the director out, forming these relationships, working on locations, that kind of thing. But for my experience, it was more of like a catch-all, so we're doing all of those things, but you also might be picking up a camera and shooting second camera. You're developing the story in many other ways, and I think the term that we use for producer really was born out of the specials and the short features and stuff that we talked about, where there wasn't really a director per se. There was no director credit for those things. It was like, if you were the producer, you were the person running those things. So in a film, the director might be looked at as sort of the creative, the person at the top of the creative hierarchy. The producer might be the person working on all of the relationships outside of that. In the case of the films that I did, it was both, right? Mm-hmm. So I was the one trying to develop these relationships for the most part, doing the interviews, and putting it together like that.
I always refer to it as keeping the train on the tracks. That's what I
right.
feel like the producer does. And when I produce, I'm keeping the train on the tracks and keeping it moving forward.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, I think in a lot of these things, producer and director could be interchangeable. And that could just be
and I think too in sports, we wear a lot of hats in comparison to traditional, film media.
That's right. And it's probably a factor of budget, right? Of resources. It's like, if you have one person that can do all of those things, why pay two, right?
Yep. That's how it's always been.